Something has been moving bald eagles into the deep south, and the people whose job it is to know why are saying, with unusual candor, that they do not know why. That sentence deserves a moment before anything else gets added to it. Bald eagles are not a mysterious species. They are the most intensively monitored large raptor in North American history, the subject of decades of federal protection, satellite telemetry studies, nest counts, population surveys, dietary analyses, breeding chronology documentation, and wintering range assessments that produced data sets running back to the 1960s. The bald eagle's recovery from the brink of extinction in the lower 48 states is one of the most celebrated conservation achievements of the 20th century, and the biological mechanics of that recovery are understood in considerable detail. We know where bald eagles nest. We know where they winter. We know what they eat, where they hunt, how they pair, how long they live, when they migrate, and how far. There are individual birds alive right now whose entire life histories are documented in federal databases. The bald eagle is not a species that surprises scientists. And yet, something is moving them south. Not a few birds. Not random individuals at the edges of normal distributional variation. A pattern. A systematic, multi-year, geographically consistent pattern of bald eagles appearing in deep south states, in numbers, in seasons, and in locations that fall well outside the distributional envelope that 50 years of intensive monitoring established as the baseline. Birds are showing up in Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Georgia, at times and in places and in concentrations that the historical record does not predict. Wildlife biologists who have spent careers watching this species are filing incident reports and exchanging data and conducting population surveys and coming back to the same uncomfortable position. The pattern is real. The cause is not established. If you find that genuinely interesting, if you are the kind of person who wants to sit with the full weight of what it means when a well-studied system produces an outcome that the scientists who study it cannot explain, stay with this. The story is more complicated and more consequential than the headline suggests, and the places where the explanation breaks down are the places where something important about the current state of North American ecosystems is trying to make itself visible. Subscribe if you're not already here, because this is the kind of story this channel was built around. The ones where the standard explanation runs out before the phenomenon does. The baseline against which the current pattern is measured needs to be established clearly, because without it, the anomaly has no shape. Bald eagles in the contiguous United States are broadly distributed into two ecological categories that reflect the species' history and biology. Breeding populations, the birds that nest and raise young, are concentrated in the northern portions of the species range. The Great Lakes states, the Pacific Northwest, the northern Rocky Mountain states, Alaska, and the northern Atlantic coast hold the largest breeding concentrations in the lower 48 states. These are the regions where the eagle population collapsed most dramatically during the DDT era, and where it recovered most substantially following the 1972 ban. Wintering populations, the birds that leave northern breeding territories when ice cover reduces access to open water and fish, traditionally moved south along a gradient that tracked latitude and the distribution of large open water systems. The Mississippi River corridor has historically been a major wintering route. The Gulf Coast states receive wintering eagles. Florida maintains year-round resident populations. The general picture is well established and well documented. Eagles breed in the north, some winter in the south, and the wintering distribution reflects a fairly predictable relationship between temperature, water, and fish availability. What the last several years have added to that picture is something that does not fit cleanly into either category. It is not simply more wintering birds arriving earlier or staying later, though that is part of it. It is not simply the natural southern expansion of breeding populations as the overall population grows, though that is also part of it. It is the appearance of birds in specific deep south locations, with a consistency and a concentration that suggests something is structuring their distribution in those places in a way that wasn't operating before, or wasn't operating as strongly. It is birds being reported in inland Mississippi counties far from major water systems that historically received few or no winter eagles. It is birds congregating in agricultural areas of the Gulf coastal plain in groups that observers with decades of local experience say they have not seen before. It is nesting activity being documented at latitudes and in habitat types that represent genuine southward extensions of the breeding range, rather than simply occupancy of known southern breeding sites. The individual observations are not dramatic. The pattern they form is. The first instinct of any wildlife biologist confronting an apparent range shift or distributional anomaly is to interrogate the data quality before interrogating the ecology. Are you actually seeing more eagles, or are you seeing more people looking for eagles and reporting what they find? This is a serious and legitimate methodological concern in an era when citizen science platforms like eBird have transformed the observational record of bird distribution by dramatically increasing the density of observers across landscapes that were previously surveyed infrequently. An apparent increase in bird reports from a region can reflect a genuine increase in bird numbers, an increase in observer effort, an improvement in reporting infrastructure, or some combination of all three. Separating these signals requires careful analysis that veteran ornithologists know better than to skip. The analysis has been done, or at least begun, in response to the bald eagle data. The conclusion from the researchers who have looked most carefully at the Deep South Eagle reports is that observer effort alone does not account for what is being documented. eBird data is correctable for effort, and when the correction is applied, the trend in eagle reports from the Deep South states does not disappear. It attenuates somewhat, as you would expect from any dataset that partially reflects observer effort inflation. But the residual signal, the part that survives the correction, remains larger than historical baselines predict. The birds being reported are being seen by experienced birders who know what they are looking at, in locations that are being surveyed with a regularity and rigor that was not characteristic of those locations 20 years ago, and the numbers coming out of those surveys are not consistent with what those experienced observers expected to see based on their historical experience of those sites. The data quality concern is legitimate. It does not eliminate the phenomenon. The second instinct is to invoke population dynamics. The bald eagle population in the contiguous United States has grown enormously since the early 1970s. The continental population estimate in the late 1960s, near the population nadir, was somewhere around 400 nesting pairs in the lower 48 states. Current estimates put the breeding population at somewhere between 9,000 and 10,000 nesting pairs in the lower 48, a population increase of more than 20-fold in roughly 50 years. When a population grows that substantially, it expands its range. Birds that would not have found territories in traditional breeding areas because those areas were saturated push into adjacent and peripheral areas. The southern expansion of bald eagle breeding populations into states like Georgia, Alabama, and Florida, where nesting was historically sparse or absent across large portions of those states, is consistent with a growing population filling available habitat at the edges of its range. This explanation is real and accounts for a portion of the pattern. The problem is that it accounts for less of the pattern than it should if it were the complete explanation. Range expansion driven by population growth follows a fairly predictable gradient. Birds move into areas adjacent to established populations first, then progressively into areas further from the core range as the adjacent areas fill. The expansion is expected to be geographically smooth and to correlate with habitat quality in a way that reflects the species' well-documented habitat preferences. Bald eagles need large bodies of open water with good fish populations and tall trees suitable for nesting in the vicinity. They avoid areas without these features with a consistency that has made their habitat associations among the most reliably predictable of any large raptor. If the Deep South distribution expansion were simply range edge filling by a growing population, it should be concentrated in areas that match those habitat criteria most closely. The observations that are generating the most puzzlement from biologists are not in those areas. They are in places that do not match the expected template particularly well. That mismatch is the heart of the anomaly. What are the candidate explanations for a distributional shift in a well-studied species that cannot be fully explained by population growth, observer effort inflation, or simple range edge expansion? The candidates are several, and they are not mutually exclusive. Each of them requires careful examination because each points to a different underlying ecological mechanism. And the difference between those mechanisms matters for how wildlife managers should think about what they are watching. The climate explanation is the one that arrives first in any conversation about range shifts in North American wildlife in the current era, and it arrives with justification. The distributional ranges of hundreds of North American bird species have shifted measurably over the past several decades in ways that are broadly consistent with the direction of climate change. Most of the well-documented range shifts are northward or to higher elevations, reflecting species tracking the conditions to which they are adapted as those conditions move in response to warming temperatures. The Deep South eagle phenomenon is moving in the opposite direction, which makes the climate explanation initially counterintuitive. But the relationship between climate change and bald eagle distribution is not simple and does not operate only through temperature. It operates through the cascading effects of temperature change on the hydrological systems that govern fish availability, ice cover, and water conditions at both ends of the migration gradient. In the northern portion of the bald eagle's range, warming temperatures are changing the ice phenology of lakes, rivers, and coastal waters in ways that affect when and where eagles can access fish. Lakes that historically froze reliably in November and remained ice-covered through March are now freezing later, covering incompletely, and thawing earlier. This is, in principle, good for eagles at northern latitudes because it extends the open water period during which they can fish. But it also changes the ecology of open water fish communities in ways that are not uniformly beneficial, as thermal stratification shifts, dissolved oxygen dynamics change, and cold water fish species face stress that affects their abundance and distribution. Some northern eagles are staying north longer than historical patterns would predict because the conditions that drove them south, specifically the closure of open water by ice, are arriving later or not at all in some years. Other northern birds are moving, but moving to different locations than historical wintering sites because the fish distribution at their traditional wintering areas has shifted. The climate signal in eagle distribution is real, but it does not produce clean, predictable responses. It produces a reorganization of the distributional pattern, whose details are worked out at the level of individual drainage basins and local water systems in ways that make it difficult to generalize. At the southern end of the gradient, climate change is operating on the Deep South's water systems in ways that are equally complex. The Gulf coastal plain and the river systems that drain into it are experiencing changes in precipitation patterns, drought frequency, and water temperature that affect the fish communities that eagles depend on. In some areas, those changes are improving conditions for large fish species that eagles preferentially target, specifically large catfish, carp, gizzard shad, and other warm water species that reach sizes suitable for eagle predation. If climate-driven changes to Gulf coastal plain waterways are increasing the abundance or predictability of large fish concentrations in locations that were previously less productive for eagle foraging. That would represent a genuine pull factor, drawing eagles into those areas. The evidence for this mechanism is indirect and circumstantial, assembled from a combination of fish population survey data, eagle observation data, and inference about foraging behavior. But it is not implausible. Wildlife biologists who study the species have not ruled it out. The aquaculture explanation is one that has been discussed in the wildlife management community for years in relation to eagle concentrations in unexpected locations, and it is one of the more concretely testable hypotheses available for parts of the Deep South anomaly. The catfish aquaculture industry, concentrated heavily in Mississippi and Alabama, operates thousands of acres of outdoor pond systems stocked with fish at densities that represent an extraordinary foraging opportunity for any fish-eating bird large enough to exploit them. Bald eagles can and do target aquaculture ponds. The industry has documented eagle depredation on fish ponds for decades, and there are established protocols for managing eagle activity at aquaculture facilities that reflect a long history of conflict between the two. What is less established is whether the scale of the aquaculture industry and its geographic distribution in the Deep South has reached a threshold where it functions as a genuine attractor for eagle populations, pulling wintering birds into areas they would not otherwise use and potentially subsidizing the establishment of breeding populations in agricultural landscapes that would not, on the basis of natural habitat quality alone, support them. The logic of the hypothesis is straightforward. A bird that discovers an aquaculture pond stocked with thousands of channel catfish at accessible depths has found a foraging resource that requires substantially less energy expenditure than hunting wild fish in river and lake systems. If the resource is reliable, meaning if the ponds are consistently stocked year after year and the eagle can learn to return to productive sites, it represents a stable food subsidy of the kind that can dramatically alter an animal's distributional behavior. Eagles are intelligent birds with strong site fidelity. An individual that discovers a productive aquaculture facility and returns to it over multiple seasons is engaging in exactly the kind of learned behavior that can anchor a bird to a location outside its expected range. If multiple birds in a regional population learn the same resource location through direct discovery or through the social facilitation that comes from observing conspecifics, the result can be a concentration of birds at that location that appears anomalous from the perspective of natural habitat assessment, but makes perfect sense from the perspective of food availability. The agricultural transformation of the Deep South, more broadly, is a factor that runs alongside and interacts with the aquaculture explanation. The Gulf coastal plain has undergone substantial land use changes over the past several decades. The conversion of longleaf pine ecosystems to managed pine plantations and agricultural land has altered the hydrology of large portions of the region in ways that have created new wetland and pond habitats. Farm ponds, stormwater retention basins, irrigation impoundments, and the water management infrastructure of industrial agriculture have added millions of acres of shallow water habitat to a landscape that historically supported less standing water. These created water bodies support fish communities that eagles can exploit. They are often associated with tall pine or hardwood trees along their margins that provide both perch sites and potential nest sites. In aggregate, the agricultural landscape transformation of the Deep South has made that landscape more suitable for bald eagles than it was 50 or 100 years ago, independent of whatever is happening to the overall eagle population size or to climate-driven shifts in traditional habitat quality. The hypothesis that most interests and most unsettles the wildlife biologists who study this question is the one that involves not just new habitat or new food resources, but something more fundamental about the structure of the eagle population itself. North American bald eagles, like most large raptors, maintain site fidelity through a combination of learned behavior and social inheritance. Young eagles learn where to go by following adults. Juveniles that make their first southward movements in autumn are not reading magnetic compasses or following internal maps in the way that some long-distance migratory species appear to navigate. They are, in part, following social cues, moving in the company of experienced birds or toward areas where they see conspecifics congregating. The distributional patterns of wintering eagle populations are, to a significant degree, culturally transmitted. Birds learn where to winter from the birds around them, and those patterns can persist for decades or shift relatively rapidly if the information being transmitted through the population changes. If something has disrupted or reorganized the social transmission of migratory and wintering information in segments of the bald eagle population, the distributional consequences could be substantial and could appear relatively quickly in observation data. The mechanism for such disruption could be demographic. A population that has grown as rapidly as the lower 48 bald eagle population has grown produces large numbers of young birds every year who are entering the information network for the first time, and who may be disproportionately influenced by the most recently successful foraging information circulating in the population. If novel foraging locations in the Deep South have been discovered by a critical mass of birds in recent years and have proven productive, the cultural transmission of that information through the population of naive juveniles could produce a relatively rapid shift in the distributional center of gravity for that segment of the population. This is not a well-established mechanism in the sense that it has not been formally tested in bald eagles. But the general principle of cultural transmission of distributional information in long-lived, socially complex birds is supported by research in multiple other raptor and large bird species, and it is not implausible as a contributing factor here. The breeding range extension is the component of the Deep South eagle phenomenon that carries the most long-term ecological significance and that wildlife managers are watching most carefully. Bald eagles nest earlier than most large birds. Nest building or refurbishment typically begins in the Deep South wintering populations in December and January, with egg-laying occurring in late January through February, and chicks fledging by late spring. The extension of nesting activity into counties and habitat types that have not historically supported eagle nests is documented. It is not yet dramatic in absolute numbers, but the trajectory of the documentation, the fact that biologists are finding new nests in new places each breeding season in states like Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, with a regularity that suggests systematic colonization rather than random wandering, is consistent with the beginning of a range expansion that could become substantially more pronounced over the next decade if current conditions persist or intensify. The significance of that range expansion for the eagle is mostly positive. A species that successfully expands its breeding range into new suitable habitat is expressing the biological success of its recovery and increasing its long-term population resilience by distributing its breeding effort across a larger and more diverse set of locations. The significance for the ecosystems receiving the expanding population is more complex and less uniformly positive. Not because bald eagles are problematic as species go, but because top predators always exert structuring effects on the communities they enter, and those effects require attention and monitoring. Eagle nesting in agricultural landscapes creates conflicts with farming operations that are well documented from other regions of the eagle's range. Eagle predation on waterfowl populations at wintering concentrations can affect the population dynamics of the prey species. Eagle competition with osprey, great blue herons, and other large fish-eating birds for nesting sites and foraging areas is well known from northern regions and will require monitoring as eagle densities increase in the south. None of these are catastrophic dynamics. All of them are worth tracking. There is a specific interaction that is receiving more attention from southeastern wildlife managers than any other, and it involves a species that the Deep South knows well and that has its own complicated conservation history. Wood storks, roseate spoonbills, tricolored herons, snowy egrets, and the other colonial waterbirds that nest in the Rookery Islands and coastal wetlands of the Gulf and Atlantic coastal plains have long constituted the visual signature of southeastern coastal ecology. They are also, in the specific context of bald eagle behavioral repertoire, potential prey items and consistent targets of kleptoparasitism. Bald eagles rob colonial waterbirds. This is a documented and well-studied behavior, and it is not trivial in its ecological effects at the colonial nesting sites where the behavior is concentrated. Large colonies of wood storks, or great egrets, that are subject to frequent eagle disturbance experience reduced nesting success through egg breakage, chick abandonment, and the metabolic costs imposed on adult birds that spend time and energy responding to predator disturbance rather than provisioning young. As bald eagle densities increase in the coastal Deep South, the frequency of these interactions at colonial waterbird nesting sites is expected to increase as well. The net effect on colonial waterbird populations of a substantially more abundant eagle predator in the same geographic space is not yet well quantified and represents one of the more pressing research gaps that southeastern wildlife biologists have identified. The legal framework surrounding bald eagles adds a layer of complexity to the management response that is worth understanding because it shapes what wildlife agencies can and cannot do in response to the anomaly they are observing. The Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act, first passed in 1940 and amended multiple times since, provides strong federal protection for the species and restricts the ability of wildlife managers to respond to eagle-related conflicts through lethal means. Depredating eagles at aquaculture facilities, disturbing nesting eagles to prevent establishment at problematic sites, and managing eagle populations through harvest are all legally constrained or prohibited. The protective framework that supported the eagle's recovery remains in place, appropriately, but it limits the toolkit available to managers who are watching the distributional shift unfold and trying to understand its implications. The primary tool available is monitoring, combined with permitted hazing at specific conflict sites. The monitoring is happening. The data it is generating is genuinely novel. The analytical capacity to interpret that data quickly enough to inform meaningful management response is, according to the researchers doing the work, not currently keeping pace with the rate at which the phenomenon is developing. The instrumentation record from satellite-tagged bald eagles is one of the most valuable data streams bearing on this question, and the picture it paints is more specific and more interesting than the summary statistics suggest. Individual birds tagged in northern breeding areas and tracked through their annual movement cycles are showing, in a meaningful fraction of cases, wintering locations and movement trajectories that diverge from the historical baseline in ways that are consistent with the pattern of Deep South observations. Some birds that wintered in traditional locations for multiple years are shifting to new wintering sites. Some birds are making what appear to be exploratory movements into areas they have not previously visited, remaining for variable periods, and returning to previously established sites or establishing at the new sites in subsequent years. The telemetry data is not a sample of the population. It is a sample of individuals that have been selected for tagging by researchers with specific questions. And that selection process introduces biases that limit how directly the findings can be extrapolated to the population as a whole. But the behavior documented in tagged individuals is the behavior of real animals making real decisions in real landscapes. And the decisions being documented include movements into Deep South locations that the historical literature would not have predicted. The most striking of these documented movements involve birds making what appear to be targeted movements to specific resource locations in the Deep South that are not large natural water bodies, but are instead the kind of created or modified water habitats associated with agricultural and aquacultural land use. A tagged bird that flies from a breeding territory in Tennessee to a catfish pond complex in the Mississippi Delta and spends 3 weeks there before returning north is doing something that the historical distributional data did not describe, and that requires explanation in terms of how the bird found that location and what information it used to make the movement decision. The telemetry record contains multiple such instances. They are not yet common enough to dominate the data set. They are common enough to establish that the behavior is real and that it is occurring in multiple individuals from multiple breeding populations. Something is directing these movements. The researchers who are watching the data accumulate do not yet have a satisfying answer to what that something is. The prey-fish dynamics in the Deep South's river and reservoir systems deserve more attention than they have received in the public discussion of the eagle anomaly, because the bald eagle's distributional behavior is ultimately governed by food availability more than by any other single factor, and the fish communities of the region's major water systems have been undergoing changes that the historical eagle distribution data does not reflect. The large reservoir systems of the southeastern United States, built primarily between the 1930s and 1970s as part of the Tennessee Valley Authority and Army Corps of Engineers dam construction programs, have matured ecologically over the past several decades in ways that affect fish community structure. Older reservoirs tend to support different fish assemblages than newly impounded ones, with the relative abundance of large, slow-moving fish species that eagles prefer shifting as the reservoir ages and its physical structure changes. If the maturation of these reservoir systems has increased the abundance of the gizzard shad, carp, catfish, and other large fish species that represent eagle foraging targets, the distributional response of eagles might be expected to reflect that improvement. The evidence for this mechanism is largely inferential, but it is consistent with what the fish survey data from major southeastern reservoir systems shows about trends in the relevant fish species over the past 2 decades. The cultural dimension of the bald eagle's presence in the Deep South is not separate from the ecological one and should not be treated as an afterthought. The bald eagle is the national symbol of the United States, and its appearance in communities that have not historically coexisted with it produces a public response that shapes what wildlife managers are able to do and what the political environment around eagle management looks like. Across the Deep South counties where eagle sightings have been increasing, the public response has been overwhelmingly positive. Local media coverage of new eagle nests generates genuine community engagement. Birding tourism associated with eagle watching contributes measurable economic activity to rural areas where wildlife-based recreation was previously limited. The creation of Facebook groups, community monitoring networks, and informal naturalist communities organized around local eagle populations represents a form of social infrastructure that did not exist in these communities before and that has value independent of its contribution to scientific monitoring. The human story of the eagle's return to the Deep South is, in many of its dimensions, a conservation success story, and the people living it deserve to understand both the ecological complexity behind the phenomenon they are witnessing and the genuine uncertainty that surrounds its causes. The Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, and other indigenous peoples of the Deep South have relationships with the bald eagle that are older by many centuries than the federal protection framework that governed the species' recovery. And those relationships provide a different kind of historical context for the current distributional shift. In the cosmologies and material cultures of southeastern indigenous nations, the eagle occupied a central symbolic and spiritual position. Eagle feathers were among the most significant objects in ceremonial practice. The eagle's presence or absence in a landscape carried meaning, that was read by communities with generations of direct ecological knowledge of those landscapes. What those communities' oral traditions and ecological knowledge say about historical eagle distribution in the Deep South, before European settlement and its subsequent alteration, is a data source that Western wildlife science has been slow to incorporate, and that would, if incorporated, substantially enrich the picture of what the baseline actually was before the baseline that 20th century ecology assumed into existence. The genetic dimension of the eagle population expansion into the Deep South has barely been examined. The bald eagle population of the lower 48 states is not genetically homogeneous. Different breeding populations retain some degree of genetic differentiation, reflecting their Pleistocene and Holocene history, and the subsequent isolation and reconnection events that shaped contemporary population structure. As eagle populations expand southward and establish new breeding populations in the Deep South, the genetic composition of those founding groups will reflect the source populations from which they are drawn. If the founding birds are disproportionately from specific northern populations with particular migratory tendencies, habitat preferences, or behavioral traits, the new southern populations may not represent a random cross-section of the species' genetic diversity. The genetic structure of emergent Deep South eagle populations and what it reveals about the source populations driving the range expansion has not been systematically studied. Tissue samples from newly established nesting birds exist in some cases but have not been analyzed in a coordinated way that would allow source population assignment. This is a research gap whose filling would substantially clarify the mechanisms behind the range expansion. The comparison with other top predators that have undergone range expansions into the American South over the same general period is instructive for what it reveals about the ecological conditions that appear to be facilitating these movements. Bald eagles are not the only large predator or predatory bird whose distribution in the Deep South is changing. Ospreys have extended breeding populations substantially southward over the same decades that eagle expansion has occurred. American white pelicans, historically associated with western interior breeding sites, have appeared in wintering concentrations on Gulf coastal plain waterways in numbers that represent a genuine range extension. Most relevant is the range expansion of coyotes into the southeastern United States, which occurred over roughly the same time period, and which went from a curiosity to a transformed ecological reality over a span of 2 to 3 decades. The coyote expansion was driven by a combination of removal of competing top predators, abundant food resources in both agricultural and suburban landscapes, and the behavioral flexibility that characterizes the species. It was largely unpredicted in its pace and extent. The comparison with the eagle anomaly is imperfect because eagles are not coyotes in any biological sense, but the parallel of a generalist or adaptable species exploiting a restructured southern landscape faster and more thoroughly than the existing distributional data predicted is worth holding in mind. The management framework for bald eagles in the Deep South was designed for a different distributional reality than the one currently developing, permitting structures, conflict resolution protocols, monitoring programs, and the interagency coordination mechanisms that govern eagle management across the jurisdiction of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the state wildlife agencies of the Southeast, were largely designed around the historical pattern of wintering eagles in predictable locations and small, localized breeding populations in Florida and a few other coastal sites. That framework is not well configured to monitor and respond to a dynamic, expanding breeding population moving through a complex agricultural and suburban landscape across multiple state jurisdictions simultaneously. The gaps in the current management framework are not the result of negligence or inadequate commitment. They are the result of a system built around historical patterns being asked to respond to a phenomenon that the historical patterns did not predict. The conversation about updating that framework, about investing in coordinated monitoring, about developing conflict resolution protocols appropriate to an expanding Deep South eagle population, is happening in wildlife management offices. It has not yet produced the institutional response that the pace of the phenomenon probably requires. The specific counties in Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana, where the anomaly is most pronounced, are worth describing in enough geographic and ecological detail that the phenomenon acquires the particularity that turns an abstraction into a place. The Pearl River Basin in south-central Mississippi drains a landscape that has changed substantially over the past 3 decades. Timber harvesting followed by agricultural conversion, combined with the water management infrastructure of the Pearl River Valley Water Management District and the associated reservoir and backwater systems, has created a patchwork of open water, early successional upland, and mature riparian forest that provides, in combination, more of what a bald eagle needs than the same geographic space provided 50 years ago. Eagle reports from the Pearl River Basin have increased each of the past 7 consecutive years in eBird data, adjusted for observer effort. The increase is not enormous in absolute terms. It is consistent in direction and consistent with anecdotal reporting from local birders and wildlife photographers who document the basin regularly. Something about the Pearl River Basin is working for eagles in a way it was not a decade ago, and the most proximate explanation that the landscape transformation has genuinely improved habitat quality for the species does not fully account for the pace of the change. The Atchafalaya Basin in Louisiana represents a different case study with its own set of ecological dynamics. The Atchafalaya is North America's largest river swamp, a sprawling network of channels, lakes, oxbows, and bottomland hardwood forest that has functioned as one of the most ecologically productive freshwater systems on the continent. Eagle use of the Atchafalaya is not new. Wintering eagles have used the basin for as long as organized surveys have documented bird distribution there. What is new is the character of that use, specifically evidence that birds are remaining later into the spring than wintering behavior predicts, and that a small but increasing number of birds have been documented in behavior consistent with territory establishment during the breeding season. Louisiana is not historically a significant bald eagle breeding state. The coastal populations that nest in the extreme southern coastal zone have been established and documented. Interior breeding in the Atchafalaya Basin represents something different, and the wildlife biologists tracking those observations are treating them with appropriate caution, neither dismissing them nor overinterpreting them, but noting that they are occurring with a frequency that requires systematic investigation. The question of what happens when a top predator expands into ecosystems that have been structured in its absence for decades or centuries is not a question that has a simple answer, and the ecological literature on predator reintroduction and recolonization events provides a range of outcomes that resists easy generalization. The wolf reintroduction to Yellowstone and the subsequent reorganization of elk behavior, vegetation structure, and riparian ecology there has been widely cited as evidence that top predator presence can restructure entire ecosystem dynamics through trophic cascades. The relevance of that example to bald eagle range expansion into the Deep South is limited by the profound biological differences between the systems. But the general principle that top predators matter to ecosystem structure in ways that extend far beyond their direct predation effects applies to eagles as well. Eagle presence reorganizes the foraging behavior of fish and waterfowl in ways that can affect where those animals use habitat, how they distribute across a water body, and which age classes are most exposed to predation. These are real ecological effects, not dramatic ones in the short term, but real and worth tracking as eagle densities increase in southern systems that have not had significant eagle presence for generations. The satellite telemetry data, the eBird record, the breeding documentation, The aquaculture conflict reports and the field observations from biologists who work these landscapes combine to form a picture that is simultaneously suggestive and frustratingly incomplete. The picture clearly shows something happening. It does not yet clearly show why. The researchers who are most deeply engaged with the data are honest about the limits of what they can currently conclude. They can say that the pattern is real and exceeds what population growth and observer effort inflation can account for. They can say that the most plausible candidate mechanisms include climate-driven changes to fish availability and ice phenology, aquaculture food subsidies, landscape transformation, increasing habitat suitability, and possible reorganization of social information transmission in a rapidly growing population. They cannot yet say which of these mechanisms is dominant, whether they are operating independently or interactively, or what the trajectory of the phenomenon will look like over the next decade. The honest position is that the explanation is not established, and the honest communication of that position, which some wildlife agencies have been willing to make and others have been reluctant to, is the appropriate starting point for a public conversation about what is being observed. The value of sitting with that honest uncertainty, rather than reaching for premature closure, is not sentimental, it is epistemological. When a well-studied species in a well-monitored ecosystem produces behavior that the existing understanding cannot fully explain, that gap is information. It is information about the limits of the model. It is information about what the model is missing. It is often, in the history of ecology, the place where something genuinely new and important about how ecosystems work becomes visible. The bald eagle phenomenon in the Deep South may ultimately turn out to have a simple explanation that was obscured by incomplete data, and that becomes obvious in retrospect once the right surveys are completed. That would be a satisfying resolution. It may also turn out to be pointing towards something more consequential about how climate change, land use transformation, and the population dynamics of recovering predator species are interacting to reorganize North American wildlife distribution in ways that our existing distributional models are not capturing. That would be a more important and more demanding resolution, one that requires sustained scientific investment and genuine intellectual flexibility from the institutions responsible for managing these systems. What is certain is that the bald eagle's presence in the Deep South is increasing, that the increase is structured in ways that go beyond simple population growth and range edge filling, and that the people whose job it is to explain distributional shifts in this species are describing the phenomenon with a candor about their own uncertainty that is refreshing precisely because it is unusual in institutional scientific communication. The standard practice in wildlife management communication is to project confidence and to emphasize what is known over what is unknown. The researchers and managers dealing with this particular situation are, in multiple forums and in conversations documented by journalists and science writers who have followed the story, doing something different. They are saying that they see the pattern clearly, that they have hypotheses, and that they do not yet have an explanation that satisfies the data. That admission, coming from people who have spent careers studying this animal in this landscape, is itself a signal that the phenomenon deserves attention from anyone who cares about how North American ecosystems are changing. The bald eagle came back from near extinction in the lower 48 states through a combination of legal protection, pesticide restriction, captive breeding, and habitat conservation that constitutes one of the genuine triumphs of North American conservation policy. The species return is a story that ought to be celebrated and learned from. What is happening in the Deep South is a new chapter of that story, one whose meaning is still being worked out by the scientists who are closest to the data. It may be a chapter about the ways in which a recovered species recolonizes habitat that it lost and discovers resources that were not there before. It may be a chapter about the ways in which climate change and land use transformation are restructuring the ecological opportunities available to a highly adaptable apex predator. It may be a chapter about something that none of the current hypotheses has yet fully articulated. The eagles are going south. The scientists are watching. The explanation is still in motion. Pay attention to where it lands.